The artifact is 150,000 years old. It's made of an artificial metal we have been unable to identify. There is a message scratched on the front. What does it say? This is a horror podcast. Consider yourselves warned. PseudoPod, episode 883. September 15th, 2023. This week's story, Baalat Ove, by Brenda S. Tolian. Hello everybody, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story comes to us from Brenda S. Tolian. Brenda is a writer in New Orleans and author of Blood Mountain, published by Raw Dog Screaming Press. Her work has appeared in numerous anthologies, such as 101 Proof Horror, Consumed Tales inspired by the Wendigo, The Jewish Book of Horror, and Twisted Pulp Magazine Issue 3. Her poetry has appeared in various publications, and she was a featured poet for the HWA publication Showcase Volume 8. This story is one of many great ones contained in the Denver Horror Collective's The Jewish Book of Horror. Find more information at brandatolian.com. Your narrator this week is Victoria Marklew, an expat Brit living in suburban Philly, still trying to make sense of life in America. You can find her blog at abroadintheusa.com. Her short story Marmor garnered an honourable mention in the genre category of the 92nd Annual Writers' Digest Writing Competition, and her first novel, Guardians of the Weave, is currently out on submission. So, listen to the voices, the ones behind the world, because whether you like them or not, what you're hearing, it's true.
Baalat Ove by Brenda Tolian, narrated by Victoria Marklew. In the night the spirits spoke with hisses and gurgles like serpents wrapped around my head. I awoke covered in sweat, barely able to breathe, so afraid of what they would ask me to do. They whispered things over and over, crying out for understanding. There was never a choice in my action, only the act itself or madness. The gift of the Eshet Baalat Ove was taboo, but if not sent by Elohim, then who? What other power could overtake a child in such a way? My grandmother said it was the power from Asherah, the Lady of the Serpent. She told me this, forbidding me from saying the name out loud. Women were killed for less, and for us death came slow, behind brick or below the soil. We were not magicians or conjurers, but unwitting necromancers with an ancient connection to the dead. They came pressing into our dreams at night with leathery bodies and wet tongues, speaking terrible truths mixed with lies. Through learning and practice we understood discernment, but this took many years. Sometimes the spirits of the dead kept us plunged deep in Sheol, neglecting our physical bodies. Eventually we would awake, starved, crawling with insects, our mouths full of teeth and stone. It was always the same when we reached for nourishment, a bit of bread, a mouthful of water. They might leave us to recover, sensing, I suppose, our uselessness in death. They did not leave us for long, descending once more, filling our mouths until we opened our bodies wide, allowing them to push into us. The visions and words flowed like a river of thought, disjointed and disturbing. Sometimes the meaning escaped us, and the spirits grew irritable and angry. Other times they touched our minds like feathers. If ignored, they filled our mouths with stones, teeth, or berries, symbolizing their intruding thoughts and displeasure. We could not deny them when they did this, or they would replicate the objects until we choked. I have only observed it once, in a child who did not know her gift. She was found with her purple cheeks stuffed, bumpy with rocks and berries oozing down her chin mixed with blood. The child did not know how to open herself. We had no choice but to obey. I was blessed to have a teacher in my grandmother, even after the day our kind was silenced on the threat of death. The king did not understand that the gift could not be silenced or stopped. We did not call it down by dark means. It was imbued at conception, a heritage that could not be refused. Though we hid far above the towns we served, they still hunted us to near extinction. My grandmother took us deep into the highlands, continuing my education, but the king's men were jackals on a blood trail. She knew they would eventually find us. On that last day, I watched, hidden, as they shut my grandmother behind brick and rock, the men sitting in grim vigil until her scratching and screaming ceased. After they left, I waited, frightened to approach our home that sat empty and tomb-like. I tried to pull the bricks down, but one layer only revealed another. I sat for many days as the spirits spoke of her death, slowly cut off from the light, then air. Beyond that wall I could not hear my grandmother, though I slept beside it for many days. For 2 years the spirits remained quiet, as if they also feared the command of the king. I lived feral in my grief and the silence of this loss of connection, until the night the spirits returned. In my dreams I heard the first whispers beyond the wall, the sound crossing between the worlds. I listened to her voice, angry and harsh within the sudden whirlwind of insect-like voices of the spirits. I awoke, my mouth forced open with gravel and berries, and I jammed my fingers behind the rocks, pushing them out so I could fill my lungs with air. Beyond, the voice filtered from the wall in its terrible words. I recognized that voice deep in my bones. I knew. My dreams continued for many days, vivid, awash in meat and blood, men screaming as a horde of bronze washed over them with no end. This horde of thousands moved in iridescent swarms that entered every opening, funneling into the nose, mouth, eyes, and nether regions. I heard their clicking mandibles chewing through the bodies of men, their mouths so full of the horde that they couldn't scream. The men tore their clothing and skin in agony, crawling toward me, grasping the hem of my robe. The terrible cacophony would merge into my mouth, screaming my eyes open. My body and face pressed upon the cool bricks, my breath the only sound after the terrible din of the dream. I closed my eyes, enjoying the quiet that blanketed my mind, seeking another sound altogether. I waited until I heard the scratching of nails, a terrible sound, yet a promise that she was also there with me. Sometimes during the day they would come pushing into the corners of my mind. "He will come, and you will tell," they hissed, rolling a stone into my mouth. Clutching my head, I asked, "Who will come?" "He will come, and another will come through," they whispered, adding a berry with another stone. "What shall I do?" I pleaded, digging fingers into my temples, seeking to dull the pain. I spat stones and juice, trying hard not to swallow. "You will feed him," they laughed before vacating. I saw them 3 days later, down in the valley, long before finding my cave. I watched the dusty caravan creeping closer. Servants darted out to explore the many caverns below, looking for the Ba'alat Ov. The spirits were strangely hushed with their coming. I washed my body and anointed myself in precious oils. My hair I let fall to my waist in long, dark curls. I remained a pure oracle, untouched by man, only invaded by spirits, a conduit of the unseen. We could copulate, but only to produce the next daughter. If sons were created, the spirits would come in the night and slip into our bellies. They would feed there for many days, ripping apart the child with tiny sharp teeth until only blood poured out of the womb. The woman would share in the agony, our spirit in direct union with our young. This was the reason there were so few of us. We did not want to chance the sorrow of growing a son. I lived with many rules of purity. The laws of the Ba'alat Ov were not so different from any oracle. Our body is treated as a sacred space. We relied on the people seeking our power to provide. The people of Endor would climb to this cave, bringing food and textiles in trade for words from the dead. They also brought news, especially of the king's men who hunted the Ba'alat Ov by command of Elohim. Yet magic is only magic when pouring out of a woman's mouth. When I was ready, I left the cave and climbed the high ridge. I felt the heavy presence of the spirits around me, but they hovered just out of reach. I started a fire, feeding it wood until it could easily be seen by those below. I wanted the man to know I expected him. I walked barefoot to the edge, my eyes sweeping the dun earth. The hills of Morah fell away to my left, and Mount Tabor to my right. I stood in a nameless place high above Endor, with the Jezreel Valley's cupped hand below. The caravan paused, and a man rode to the front. I could not see who he was, but my mouth began filling with small stones like smooth teeth. I knew he was the one the spirits spoke of. I turned the stones with my tongue, retreating to the fire, spitting them into the flames. I won't deny you. I did not know if I spoke to the spirits or the man. I watched the man consult with his armoured column, the metal shining under the dwindling sunlight. Thousands of lights flickered in the valley to the southwest, a vast army waiting for battle. I sensed they were in opposition to the man who parted from the caravan. Alone he rode to the base of the ridge, glancing up, perhaps noting the smoke of my fire. All around the air circulated in ropes of warmth and ice. Hushed whispers flowed, ancient voices in sing-song. Their words were dark and terrible, melting my knees and making my hands tremble. Something foreboding followed in the wake of the man. He approached on foot, forced to leave his animal before the steep climb to the heights where I watched. There was pride in his countenance, a nobility that suggested he was someone of importance. He grasped the rock with sure hands, his hair a dark frame around his face when he looked upwards. The face he showed was aged but handsome, though I did not know him. I watched him climb ant-like, and noted that he seemed unremarkable, though the spirits shuddered around me. His face was pained as he pulled himself over the lip of rock and sat, resting, watching me with careful eyes. I walked around to the furthest side of the fire, waiting for him to catch his breath. His eyes flicked down the long incline he had climbed to reach me, and with weary movements he stood, slowly approaching the fire. His dark eyes rested on me, and he gasped, realizing that my eyes glimmered gold, a hereditary mark of the spirits. He opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it. I didn't know who he was, but I did know that he was unaccustomed to fear. You act shocked that you stand in the land of the Ba'alat Ov? This is strange, since you decided in your heart to find me, I said quietly. He swallowed, stepping closer to the fire. I am told you have a talisman to speak to the dead. The spirits rumbled awake at the sound of his voice dipping from the ice and flowed into my mouth. I tongued 2 teeth that were not my own, allowing the voices to speak. I stepped closer to the fire and spat the teeth into its flames. A woman's voice wailed from the depths of the cavern behind. The man froze, glancing into the cavern as I shivered with understanding. My grandmother could not form true words in the spirit. Her tongue had been torn away and thrown into the fire before she was buried behind the brick. Instead, she moaned and scratched, sometimes tapped on the bricks. Now, however, she screamed. She screamed as she did so long ago, the day they took her in desperate warning. Before me, appearing ordinary, was a king. I nodded towards the cave. You kill my kind, do you not? My grandmother cries in her grave behind the wall. The man looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I pushed the hair from my face, waiting. The man stood silent, his face mutating from disgust to desperate need. He crossed his arms and walked around the fire. I threw out a hand in warning. "Do not come closer." "No harm will come to you. I need a necromancer to call upon a friend only." I smiled then, feeling how close to the truth I stood. I wanted to push him, make him say it aloud. "Who are you to claim such power?" "I am a king." I laughed, curling my hands across my belly. A king would not lower himself to approach a Baal Ov. "Elohim turns his back to me," he spat, his eyes alight with anger. "I cannot become any lower." "So, you seek to speak with the dead?" He nodded, his shoulders dropping in shame. "Who, then, do you seek?" "Shmuel." I laughed again with bitterness. My mouth began to fill with teeth, smooth and small like children's. Shmuel the prophet, a man who spoke with spirits but was blessed by Elohim, would curse this man and me. "I need his instruction, as he did while living," Saul begged. I could feel the danger in this request. This spirit, if he would come, would be angered if funneled through a woman's mouth. "Please," the king whispered. I walked around the fire. I did not have a choice. I stepped closer to Saul, reaching up hands to either side of his face. He tried to look away as I stared into his dark eyes. "I am the talisman," I said. I allowed my soul to open, let my head fall back. The stars above shimmered as the spirits descended through my open mouth. I felt them crawling deep into my chest, allowing them to take up the spaces I opened to them. I felt their tiny teeth biting, slicing bits of my insides. I never allowed them to enter me in this way, and they rolled through me like hungry little ghosts. My head wrenched forward, struck by the sudden weight of the spirits pressing in. The crowding spirits filled my mouth with teeth, cutting my gums and tongue. Blood dripped down my chin as I struggled to stand upright. Saul clasped my hands, my fingernails digging into his skin. He attempted to step back, his face contorted with horror. I felt a new, powerful presence pouring in, pushing back the lesser spirits. I hoped it might be my grandmother, quitting the cavern and coming to my rescue, but I could hear her screams growing louder from the cave. Invisible hands clutched my body, holding me up, stretching my limbs. My neck snapped back, and my vision was crowded with stars again that wavered closer and closer. This spirit, so dense, burying itself deeper and deeper, burning like fire. It expanded, racing down my neck, filling my whole body with heat and anger. I joined with it and felt murderous rage. It shook within me, awakening. With blood filling my mouth, it spoke through me. "King Saul, why do you wake me from my sleep?" Saul stumbled, falling to his knees in front of me. "Shmuel, please," Saul begged on his knees, arms out in supplication. "Elohim has abandoned me." The voice exploded out of my chest. "Elohim has turned away from you. Your seed, your reign, your kingdom is at an end." Saul crumbled, his chin bowed low to the ground, sobbing. The spirit forced my hand to close, my fingers gesturing downward. "The Philistines are at your feet even now. Look down into the thousands of lights that glow in the Jezreel Valley." Saul raised his head to the darkening valley below, the lights flickering from the uncountable fires of his enemy. He gasped, gulping big breaths of air, his body dropping to the ground. "David will take your place," the voice thundered. The thing within me looked down on the crumpled king. I felt its disgust seething within my bones. Suddenly, The presence pulled out of my body. Hot pain filled me, grabbing my organs, ripping them upwards towards my mouth. I screamed, crumbling to the ground beside Saul, the presence punching gaping holes in my soul. It cut open the places I tried to keep closed off from the lesser spirits. The spirits took advantage of this until I was drowning in blood and teeth. My vision darkened as I flew inward. In shadows, I saw armies meeting, swords drawn, heads as they rolled from necks spraying blood. I saw the sons of the king die as I flew like a bird above the desperate battle. Below, I saw Saul and swooped closer. He was standing on Mount Gilboa, only a little way from the corpses of his 3 sons. The king begged his armor-bearer to kill him as he ripped an arrow from his side. He reached out, holding his sword aloft, his arm shaking. The spirits whispered in my ear, "He blames you." The man shook his head, refusing the sword of his king. Saul lowered his arm and twisted the blade until the point was up, bearing the hilt in the dirt. His jaw flexed, his back arched. Hesitating, he looked up, and his eyes fixed on mine. I did not see blame there, only guilt. Saul slammed his chest on the blade, pushing down until the tip bit through his back, slicing through until his face was in the dirt. His body rolled to the side, contorting as his spirit uncoiled itself from the flesh. I took to the air and flew down to him. Landing near his head, I dug my fingers into his long hair. The king begged to die in soundless whisper. The servant screamed at me, but didn't approach. Saul's mouth opened, his tongue rolling out as his spirit fled. I leaned down, touching my lips to his mouth. I opened, my teeth now merged with the spirits, biting down until I felt the tongue slicing away. I jerked my head back, pulling with my teeth until the fleshy bits tore. I chewed the salty taste of his tongue, still warm, and swallowed. I felt the rough flesh going down, filling my belly. I fell back into darkness, the vision smoky and swirling all around me. I felt the spirits siphoned through my mouth, spooling upwards like a pillar. I slept. My eyes startled open, my belly aching with hunger. The king watched me from his seat beside the fire as I tried to sit up. His eyes, red from tears, flicked from my face to the lights in the valley. When he looked at me again, I saw the haunted look of death's shadow. I knew that the time and place was near, and that Elohim would not lend a hand in peace. "There is no forgiveness," he said simply. I shook my head. The visions dissipated, and I wondered if I spoke for Elohim or my grandmother. "Let me feed you, my lord."
The language in this one. Just amazing assemblies of words that tell you everything in a way I've never heard them told before. Screaming My Eyes Open is lyrical. It grounds you. It sets you in the character with their heart pounding and their eyes wide and the after image of what they've just seen not fading nearly fast enough. But there's one line in this story which I think is the most important one, for me anyway, and it's, "We had no choice but to obey." It rings up and down these hills like an echo. That opening description of blood mixing with berries, the direct intervention of the dead, the constant sense that they're just behind us, and how much that curdles the familiar, comforting idea of ancestral knowledge. The dead are here. They've always been here, and we're doing it wrong, and they can't stop us, so they control when they need to, and when they need to, and when they have to, are very different things. We all rail against being trapped in our histories. We all try and write our own stories, but the thought of doing so with every generation that preceded us, trying to make corrections, it's funny, until you realize it's sweet. Until you realize it's tragic. until you realize it's horrifying. And speaking of horrifying, there's this line. Before me, appearing ordinary, was a king. This feels like the first reveal of a monster, and in a sense, it is. The scale of this story really comes to the fore here. Tiny people picking their way across a vast landscape, not remotely in control of the colossal events they instigate, but somehow still wanting to try. Somehow still trying to write their own story, even as they visit someone who will tell them just how impossible, how laughable that is. A king is hubris persisting, until suddenly they aren't. But all of this is just how we get to the final moment here. The abject tragedy of two people trapped in events thousands of times their size. Driven by the needs and demands of structures they've been born into, and the needs of the people who preceded them have left the stage, and yet are still screaming meaningless demands from the sidelines. Horror of the personal and impersonal, rammed together and just waiting for the taste of berries and stones to fill their mouths. Great work, everyone. And that includes you, because you are a vital part of our operation. We're an independent production, you see. A non-profit these days, in fact, and entirely donation-powered, and that's where you come in. We rely on you to pay our authors, staff, cover our costs, the whole bit. And right now, that's pretty difficult. And it's pretty difficult for you too. We're very aware of that. We know there's a recession, a pandemic, and yet here we are, asking you for money in exchange for art. Because the awful truth of existing in the world we live in is this. We need money to make art. And if you like the art we make, and if you have the cash, we could really use it. It's not a one-sided transaction either, don't worry, we don't do those. Not only do you get the stories we release every week, but you also get all sorts of other stuff. We have PayPal and Patreon subscriptions that start at $5 a month. Both of those get you access to our audio archive. The Patreon subscription tiers get you all sorts of goodies at the higher levels as well. I'm not saying stickers. I'm saying stickers. I'm sure there are stickers. Regardless, please help out if you can. I promise you it is always needed. Also, now we're a non-profit. You have some very real tax benefits to helping us tell more stories to you. In addition to, as I say, getting more stories from us. So it's a win two different ways. If you can't help financially, we understand completely. Like I said, times are tough everywhere. But if that is the case, could I please ask you to consider talking about us? Because you'd be amazed how much that helps too. If you liked an episode, please link to it, or blog about it, or leave a review on your podcatcher of choice, or your social media of choice. And there's rather more of those than there were a few months ago, so the more people talk about us in the more different places, the better. It all helps. We need all the help, and with your help, we can keep doing this. So if you help out already, thank you. And if you want to start helping out, thank you. And if you don't know where to start, hopefully that's a pretty good place for you to find a road into becoming part of the vital element of the operation that you, our audience, are. PseudoPod is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We'll be back next week with episode 884, again with audio production by Chelsea, and again hosted by me. Our story will be Report on the Flanking Action, and it's written and narrated by Larry Blameyer. We'll see you then, but before we do, PseudoPod wants to remind you, and those of you with a classical bent will not be surprised to hear this coming, the play's the thing, wherein PseudoPod will catch the conscience of the king. We'll see you next time, folks. Until then, have fun.
An arm appeared from nowhere on the shape, seemingly projected like the pseudopod of a protozoan.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.